Town criers were the original social media. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world without screens, without feeds, without those little rectangles glowing at us at 2 in the morning. Back then, news didn't scroll past your eyes in a blur. It shouted itself into your ears. Literally, yes. Before the internet, before newspapers became common, before most people could even read, there were the town criers, human push notifications. Almost always men who walked into a square, rang a bell, and announced the latest decree.
Scandal?
Or a new tax. And unlike your phone, you couldn't mute them. They just happened. Right in the middle of your bread buying. Now the thing about town criers is they weren't just local gossips elevated to civic duty, though that would have been much more entertaining. They were official. They carried the authority of the crown or the mayor, or at least someone with an alarming wig. The Belugeria handbell served the same purpose as the little notification ding, a way to grab attention. Hear that was not so much a medieval flourish as it was the ancient version of this just in. And while today we get endless notifications we didn't ask for, your cousin liked a picture of a salad, people in the 14th century actually relied on these shouted updates, because otherwise they wouldn't know anything. Imagine the entire government's communication strategy boiled down to one sweaty man with a bell, hoping he could project loudly enough over the sound of horses. Now, you might think this job sounds prestigious. After all, you're the literal voice of authority. But no. It was more like being the internet's comment section come to life, because every announcement, no matter how boring, guaranteed some heckling. Let's picture it. The crier calls out a new tax on salt. Salt, which you absolutely need to live. And suddenly, he's the embodiment of government oppression. People mutter, people throw things. It's basically medieval Twitter, except instead of trolling in text, it's cabbages to the face. Of course, he couldn't just mutter the news and shuffle away. Criers were legally required to be heard. If no one could hear you, the decree technically hadn't been issued, which is why criers were usually chosen for lung capacity. The louder the better. Think of them as the opera singers of local governance. And because humans are humans, even when acting as mouthpieces of the king, they still picked up nicknames. In England, one particularly booming fellow was called the Thunderer. Another, who stammered, was less affectionately known as Stop-Start. It's a cruel world, but at least everyone knew who you meant. Now, this might feel quaint. A bell, a shout, a bit of heckling. But these criers shaped public life far more than we give them credit for. They controlled timing. If you only learned about a market day because someone bellowed it from a corner, then whoever controlled the crier controlled your calendar. It was curated news without the illusion of choice. And naturally, rulers found ways to abuse this. Announcements about executions? Always public. Announcements about rising food prices? Mumbled at odd hours. A technique still very much in use by politicians today. Though now it's buried in press releases posted at 11 p.m. The role of crier, by the way, came with some odd perks. For one, criers were legally untouchable. If you assaulted a crier while he read the king's words, you were essentially assaulting the king. Which sounds grand, till you realize it mostly just protected them from angry bakers who didn't like hearing about new flour regulations. This immunity led to some interesting personal lives. Few criers became notorious gossips themselves, using their untouchable status to spread stories about neighbors. In at least one English town, a crier was fined not for failing to announce the official proclamations, but for announcing too many unofficial ones. He turned himself into a walking rumor mill. Basically, medieval Reddit with one very loud moderator. Let's drift over to France for a moment. French criers, les criers publics, had even more ceremonial pomp. They wore bright livery often, in blue and red, with little coats of arms on the chest. Imagine your town gossip suddenly showing up in full cosplay of the mayor's heraldry. Hard to ignore. One famous Parisian crier in the 16th century had a voice so loud that people swore they could hear him across the Seine, which, considering Parisian noise levels even then, is either miraculous or deeply irritating. Probably both. But criers weren't just about political decrees. They announced lost property, sales, theater openings, births, deaths. Essentially, they were Craigslist before Craigslist. If your pig wandered off, you didn't post a notice. You hired a man to yell about it until the pig turned up. Naturally. This created a lot of overlap between official state matters and Gertrude's missing goose. Kings and mayors were not always thrilled to have their urgent tax reforms shouted in the same breath as, "Please return the goat with the limp." But there wasn't really another system now. Perhaps the most human element in all of this, criers also had to deal with being misheard, which when your entire job is accuracy, is a problem. A mumbled decree could easily turn new levy on barley into new levy on barley ale, which are two very different things in a drinking culture. Several minor riots in England were sparked by exactly this kind of miscommunication. So yes, medieval society could collapse over one poorly articulated vowel. To avoid this, some criers developed personal techniques. One rolled his R's so dramatically, he sounded like he was auditioning for Shakespeare. Another slowed his speech to a crawl, stretching out each syllable like molasses. It's probably very soothing if you weren't in a rush to know whether your bread was about to double in price. As towns grew, so did the reach of the criers. They became mobile, walking routes, stopping at markets, taverns, churches, always ringing that bell. Imagine living above a market square with one of these men, stationed outside your window, announcing news at dawn. He was the medieval equivalent of a push notification that you could never swipe away. And because this is history, the role inevitably became hereditary in some families. Yes, dynasties of criers. Grandfather, father, son, all yelling their way through the centuries, which meant entire lineages defined by big lungs and bells. The family gatherings must have been deafening. One particularly long-running family in Shrewsbury produced 6 consecutive criers over 2 centuries. Their surname was ironically Whisper, which just goes to show the universe has a sense of humor, and then there's the irony of literacy. By the 18th century, more and more people could read, newspapers were appearing, pamphlets circulated. Suddenly, the shouting man with the bell seemed a little outdated. But instead of being phased out gracefully, criers doubled down on theatrics, louder bells, fancier outfits, even attempts at catchphrases. Because if you're competing with print, you might as well be entertaining. There are records of criers in England adding little rhymes to their announcements. One would declare taxes with a jaunty couplet, which at least softened the blow. Another inserted sarcastic asides like, "And of course our beloved monarch has found yet another way to spend your pennies." He wasn't fired. People liked it too much. The decline was slow. Some towns kept criers into the 19th century, not because they were needed, but because people were fond of them. It's like keeping an old notification sound, because it feels comforting. The bell became tradition, even as the message moved to print. And yes, astonishingly, a handful of official town criers still exist today, mostly in England and Canada. They dress in tricorn hats, red coats, and ring bells at ceremonies. They don't announce new taxes anymore, though. Wouldn't that be fun? But they do lend a theatrical air to local events. In other words, they've become living historical cosplay, shouting in public so we don't have to. So the next time your phone buzzes with something entirely unimportant, you can thank history for inventing the concept. The town crier walked, so your notifications could run. Unlike your phone, you couldn't turn them off, unless you moved. Let's drift gently onward, then from bells and voices to the people who commanded them. Because if criers were the messengers, the real stories, the entertainingly unfortunate ones, belonged to the royals behind the messages. And as we'll see, their personal lives were rarely as polished as the decrees shouted in their names. Charles II of Spain, the unfortunate bewitched king. Hey everyone, let's drift further into the candlelit gloom of European palaces. Tonight, we're stopping in Spain, specifically the late 17th century when the throne was occupied by a man who, through no fault of his own, became the poster child for why cousins should not marry cousins for 200 years straight. Charles II of Spain. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched, a nickname that suggests mystery, sorcery, or at least something mildly exciting. In reality, it was shorthand for, "We cannot explain how this man is still alive." Charles was born in 1661, the only surviving son of King Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. By this point, the Habsburg dynasty had been diligently marrying their close relatives for generations. They seemed convinced that love could only exist within a 3-foot radius of their own bloodline. The family tree was less a branching oak and more a snake swallowing its own tail. Charles's own parents were uncle and niece, his grandparents, also closely related. If you drew out the family chart, it wouldn't sprawl, it would just loop back on itself like a confused doodle. And so, Charles entered the world carrying the genetic baggage of centuries. Descriptions of the baby prince were not encouraging. One contemporary wrote that he was so weak that he seemed hardly likely to survive, which, in the language of 17th century courtiers, was the polite version of "this child looks like he's already auditioning for the afterlife." Miraculously, he did survive, but the price of that survival was visible. His jaw jutted out in the infamous Habsburg chin, exaggerated to almost caricature levels. People said he could barely chew food. He drooled constantly. He struggled to speak clearly. And he was small. So small that by the time he was in his 20s, visitors still described him as childlike. Not in personality, in actual appearance. One ambassador reported back that the king appeared scarcely able to support himself. Imagine the ruler of one of the most powerful empires on earth being described like a frail puppet propped up in fancy clothes. Not ideal optics. Naturally, court physicians tried to fix him. They prescribed every bizarre remedy available. Herbal concoctions that smelled like compost. Mineral baths that probably just gave him rashes. Bleedings and purges because why not remove more blood from a man who looked half dead? Already one physician even recommended goat's milk as a miracle cure. Charles drank it faithfully. He did not improve, unless the goal was to smell faintly of barnyard. Now, despite his condition, Charles was king, which meant he had responsibilities. Chief among them, producing an heir. And here is where centuries of inbreeding met the desperate politics of dynasties. At 18, Charles was married to Marie-Louise of Orleans, the French princess. A political move to patch up relations with France. Marie-Louise was lively, charming, and young, which was unfortunate because Charles was none of those things. Contemporaries record her dismay at meeting her husband. He could barely walk, had little to say, and when he did attempt conversation, it was a slurry of half-formed words. Her letters home to France, written in the politest possible tones, still radiated despair. One line read simply, "I shall never be happy." The marriage, predictably, did not produce children. Charles, according to rumors, may not have understood the mechanics. Or, if he did, he was too frail to follow through. Physicians again became involved, prescribing all manner of fertility rituals. At one point, he was advised to drink a potion made from pulverized bull's testicles. He dutifully tried it. Unsurprisingly, it did not help. Marie-Louise, trapped in Spain with no escape, sank into depression. She gorged on sweets as comfort. She grew heavier, more despondent, and eventually died young at just 26. The official report said appendicitis. Others whispered suicide. Many more believed poisoning because, in courts, every untimely death was automatically blamed on poison. Charles, devastated, mourned her with uncharacteristic intensity. Court records say he wept for days, which was touching, though perhaps also a bit late. But dynasties demand heirs, so the search began again. His next wife was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. She arrived in Spain, determined at least, outwardly, to succeed where her predecessor had not. Maria Anna was ambitious and politically shrewd. She quickly realized her husband's limitations and essentially took over much of court politics, which, in fairness, was not difficult when the king struggled to sign his own name. But even she could not solve the heir problem. She brought a formidable dowry, an entourage of meddling German relatives, and a strong will but no children. And with each passing year, Charles grew weaker, sicker, and more obviously incapable of continuing the dynasty. Now, in the midst of this tragic spectacle, people searched for explanations. How could a king be so cursed? The obvious answer, centuries of inbreeding, was not something anyone wanted to admit. So they turned to the supernatural. Thus, the nickname, the Bewitched. Many Spaniards truly believed Charles was under a curse. Perhaps cast by witches, perhaps as divine punishment for the sins of his ancestors, which, given the bloody record of Spanish rulers, was a very long list. Priests were summoned to exorcise him. Holy relics were placed under his pillow. He endured endless prayers and rituals, as though chanting could untangle chromosomes. At one point, a friar declared that the king's sperm had been bewitched by demons, which, while imaginative, was not medically accurate. Meanwhile, Spain itself was collapsing. The empire, once flush with silver from the Americas, was drowning in debt. Armies were weak, colonies restless. And at the center of it all was Charles, who could barely walk across a room without support. Foreign ambassadors began circling like vultures, reporting home that Spain would not last much longer. Everyone knew that when Charles died without an heir, Europe would be plunged into conflict over who got the spoils, which is exactly what happened. Charles lingered longer than anyone expected. He lived to 38, which for him was practically heroic. In his final years, he was described as emaciated, his skin yellow, his hair falling out, his teeth rotted, his body swollen in odd places. One autopsy report, gleefully preserved by history, claimed his body was so malformed that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs consumed, his intestines rotted, his head full of water. It reads less like medical notes and more like an itemized list of curses. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II finally died. Spain mourned, or at least they performed the motions of mourning. Many also sighed in relief, because his death meant resolution was finally possible, and indeed, his passing triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a sprawling European conflict that dragged on for over a decade. Charles himself had been too weak to rule, but in death, he was strong enough to plunge the continent into chaos. Looking back, Charles II is often remembered as the sad end of the Spanish Habsburg line. His life is studied not for his achievements, he had none, but for the cautionary tale of genetics. He is the living embodiment of what happens when dynasties value bloodline purity over common sense. And yet, in a way, he is also strangely sympathetic. He did not choose his birth. He did not orchestrate his family tree, suffered endlessly, endured humiliations, became the subject of whispers, prayers, and rumors of witchcraft, while bearing the crushing weight of a crown. Too heavy for anyone in his condition, Charles II, the bewitched king, may have been frail. He may have been mocked. But he was also, in many ways, a victim of the dynasty that created him. A man whose only true legacy was to demonstrate the perils of too much cousinly affection. Let's drift onward. Then, from the dim halls of Spain to the equally bizarre corridors of other European courts, because Charles was not the only royal whose personal life read like tragic comedy. Next, we'll float toward the French court, where elegance and scandal often danced together in powdered wigs. Louis XIV, the Sun King who never set on himself, hey everyone. Let's float now from the shadows of Spain into the glittering candlelight of Versailles. It's time to visit Louis XIV of France. He's known to history as the Sun King, a monarch so enamored with his own existence that he essentially rebranded himself as celestial, and yes, he pulled it off. For over 70 years, he reigned as the most dazzling, most absolute king Europe had ever seen. But behind the brocade and wigs, Louis's personal life was a long series of vanity projects, mistresses, and digestive complaints. Louis was born in 1638, after 23 years of his parents' childless marriage, which at the time was so unlikely that the birth was hailed as a miracle. He was nicknamed Dudon, God-given, a flattering start for a baby who would spend the rest of his life acting as though heaven itself existed to compliment him. From the beginning, he was taught to view himself as sacred. Courtiers bowed. kissed his hand, and treated his every movement as meaningful. By the time he reached adulthood, Louis no longer saw a difference between himself and France. His famous line, "L'état c'est moi, I am the state," wasn't bluster. He meant it. He believed it. And honestly, so did everyone else. Because what was the alternative? Tell him he was being dramatic, or that would have ended. Very badly, Louis became king at the tender age of 4, which sounds impressive until you remember that a toddler doesn't make many policy decisions. Actual power was held by his mother, Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. But even as a child, Louis was a performer. He adored costumes, music, and ceremony. He learned that attention could be commanded with enough lace and velvet, which set the tone for his entire reign. Politics is theater now. Louis's reign is usually summarized in grand strokes: the wars, the expansion of France, the cultural flourishing. But if you peek behind the marble columns, his day-to-day life was equal parts absurd and intimate. Let's start with mornings. The king's rising from bed was not a private affair. It was a full ritual, called the lever. At least 100 courtiers packed into his chamber each dawn to watch him wake up. Some were there to hold his shirt, others to present his wig. Even the act of handing him a sock could be a political honor. Imagine jostling for position just to pass a man his trousers. That was the Versailles career ladder. And naturally, the closer you got to his bare royal foot, the more powerful you were. Louis basked in this. He understood the psychology. Keep the nobility competing for silly privileges, and they won't have the time or energy to challenge your authority. It worked brilliantly. France became an absolute monarchy, while half its aristocrats squabbled over the chance to hand the king his toothbrush, of course. All this splendor masked a body that was not always cooperative. Louis suffered from terrible dental problems. His teeth rotted early, leaving him with constant pain and dreadful breath. Courtiers recorded that conversations with him were best kept brief, if you valued your nostrils. Then came the infamous anal fistula. Yes, a medical condition so unpleasant that we can only describe it delicately. Let's just say it was a painful infection that made sitting a misery. In 1686, surgeons performed a risky operation without anesthesia, of course. They used specially designed instruments that looked more like medieval torture devices than medical tools. Louis, to his credit, endured the ordeal stoically. Because he was the king, the operation became a cultural event. Courtiers composed poems about it. Artists painted allegories comparing the king's backside to heroic triumphs. Surgeons used the publicity to advertise their services. It was, in short, the world's first celebrity medical drama. The good news: the surgery worked. The bad news: Versailles never stopped talking about the royal behind when he wasn't being dissected. Louis dedicated himself to control of nobility, of culture, and of his own image. This extended into architecture. He built Versailles not just as a palace, but as a stage set. Every hallway, every garden, every fountain was designed to focus attention on him. The Hall of Mirrors wasn't just decoration, it was a tool of propaganda. Because if you surround people with gold and reflections of your own majesty, they start believing it. And Louis never let anyone forget his chosen symbol, the sun. He performed in ballets dressed as Apollo, the sun god, radiating golden light. Subtlety was not his strong suit. But the message landed. Louis was the center, and everyone else orbited. Now about his personal life. Louis was not monogamous, not even remotely. He had a long string of mistresses, both official and unofficial. The most famous was Madame de Montespan, witty and ambitious, who bore him several children. At one point, she was so influential that courtiers referred to her as the true queen, but scandals followed. Montespan was linked perhaps unfairly to the affair of the poisons, a lurid Parisian case involving fortune-tellers, black masses, and whispered infanticide. Did she actually dabble in dark arts to keep the king's affection? Probably not. Did people enjoy gossiping about it? Absolutely. Eventually, Louis shifted affections to Madame de Maintenon, who was pious. In Sirius, the complete opposite of Montespan. With Maintenon, he even may have secretly married her in a private, unrecorded ceremony, which is ironic given how much he loved public ritual. Perhaps he finally wanted something just for himself. Despite all the mistresses, Louis was not indifferent to family. He acknowledged many of his illegitimate children, giving them titles and positions, which of course irritated the legitimate nobility, who had to pretend this was perfectly fine. His official queen, Maria Theresa of Spain, endured his philandering with quiet dignity. She once remarked, "There is nothing about him that is not lovable, except that he does not love me," which is both tragic and painfully accurate. Louis also had a fondness for ceremony around food. Meals were another performance, the grand quirkier, where nobles watched him eat, and he ate prodigiously. Soups, meats, pastries, fruits, yet digestive issues plagued him. His doctors constantly debated how to manage his stomach. While courtiers politely ignored the king's audible indigestion, it's strange to imagine one of the most powerful men in the world, sitting in splendor, attended by dozens of courtiers, while quietly trying to suppress burps. But that was Versailles, a palace where reality was always dressed up in gold. As he aged, the Sun King dimmed. He outlived his queen, most of his mistresses, several of his children, and even grandchildren. By his 70s, he was still ruling, still performing rituals, but his body was collapsing. In 1715, at the age of 76, gangrene set into his leg. Surgeons considered amputation, but the king refused. He endured the pain for days, calmly telling courtiers to look at his suffering as an example of Christian patience. Finally, on September 1st, he died. His reign had lasted 72 years, the longest of any major European monarch. France emerged from it both culturally dazzling and financially ruined. Versailles was magnificent, but the treasury was empty. The sun had shone brilliantly, but he had also scorched his own kingdom. Louis XIV's legacy is complicated. He is remembered as the epitome of absolute monarchy, as the man who turned France into the model of courtly grandeur. But he is also remembered for ego, for endless wars, for that fistula surgery immortalized in poetry. Behind the mirrors and fountains, he was still a man with bad teeth, bad digestion, and an obsessive need to be adored, which, in the end, makes him oddly human. The Sun King may have wanted to be eternal, but he too rose and set. And so, from the dazzling but exhausting halls of Versailles, let's drift on to another dynasty. Because while France glittered under wigs and chandeliers, England was wrestling with its own peculiar royal entanglements. Next, we'll wander over to the British Isles, where the Hanoverians will provide us with more oddities, gout, and scandal. George I and the awkward arrival of the Hanoverians when Louis XIV finally expired in his Versailles bed. Across the Channel, England was dealing with its own succession headaches. The Stuart line with all its civil wars and Catholic Protestant. Tujavor had sputtered into uncertainty. The solution Parliament came up with was, naturally, to look abroad for the nearest Protestant relative they could tolerate. And that relative turned out to be Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, known to us as George I of Great Britain. It's worth pausing to appreciate how convoluted this was. Parliament actually passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, specifying that only Protestants could inherit the throne. This neatly excluded about 50 Catholics, who were much closer in bloodline, which meant the throne skipped down a very long list until it landed on George, a German prince whose main qualification was simply not Catholic. So, in 1714, George became King of Great Britain and Ireland. A man who could barely speak English, who had never shown much interest in England, and who arrived on his new island with his German mistresses in tow. The English public was thrilled. Or not. George I's personality was not designed to win over hearts. He was reserved, blunt, and seemed perpetually unimpressed by his new kingdom. He spoke mainly German and French, which meant court proceedings often sounded like badly translated farce. But perhaps the most awkward aspect of George's life was his marriage. Back in Hanover, he had wed Sophia Dorothea of Celle. The union was purely political. It united territories and strengthened claims, but the couple loathed one another. George was cold and suspicious. Sophia Dorothea was lively and independent. She eventually took a lover, a Swedish nobleman named Count Kingsmark. Unfortunately for her, royal affairs did not remain private. In 1694, the Count mysteriously disappeared, almost certainly murdered. His body conveniently never found. Sophia Dorothea was accused of plotting against her husband. The punishment was swift. She was divorced, stripped of her title, and locked away in the castle of Alden. She would remain imprisoned there for over 30 years until her death. George never forgave her, never allowed her freedom. And when he became King of Britain, he forbade any mention of her existence at court. So the first Hanoverian monarch began his reign with the awkward reality that his wife was still alive, but permanently confined, like an inconvenient secret stuffed in an attic. His English subjects, meanwhile, were baffled by their new monarchs. Habits. George traveled with 2 German mistresses, known collectively as the Elephant and the Maypole, nicknames coined by snickering courtiers. The Elephant was large and imposing. The Maypole was tall and thin. Neither spoke English. Both wielded influence simply by proximity. It was hardly the glamorous romantic image a new dynasty might have hoped for. Parliamentarians grumbled. Pamphleteers mocked, and Londoners took to lampooning their king as a foreign boor more interested in Hanover than Britain, which to be fair was accurate. George spent long stretches of his reign back in Hanover, treating England as a side project. Yet, despite his unpopularity, George I oversaw important shifts. His disinterest in English politics ironically strengthened Parliament. Ministers began to wield more real authority, especially Robert Walpole, who was often considered Britain's first prime minister. George didn't much care for long English speeches anyway, so letting Walpole handle matters suited him. Thus, from one disengaged king grew the beginnings of modern constitutional monarchy. Still, the awkwardness never faded. At court, conversations often descended into a jumble of languages. Courtiers complained that the king looked dour-eyed quickly and preferred the company of his dogs to his ministers. English was so foreign to him that he once supposedly quipped, "I speak no English, but I understand all," a statement that was both untrue and slightly menacing. His death, fittingly, came not in Britain, but in Hanover. In 1727, at the age of 67, George suffered a stroke while traveling. He died on the road, far from London, far from the throne he had technically ruled for 13 years. His body was returned to Hanover, where he was buried. England had gained a king, but never really adopted him. His legacy was, in short, distant, foreign, awkward. But at least he was Protestant, which for Parliament was the entire point, the real entertainment. However, came with his son, George II, where George I was cold and stiff. George II was fiery, irritable, and more than a little absurd. George II quarreled endlessly with his father. Their fights were legendary. At one point, young George was physically kicked out of St. James's Palace during an argument. His pregnant wife shoved down a staircase in the chaos. The Hanoverians did not specialize in warm family dynamics. When George II finally inherited the throne, he brought energy, but also comical temper. He was famously short, just over 5 feet tall, and sensitive about it. His tantrums were frequent, his outbursts memorable. He swore in multiple languages, often mixing German, French, and broken English into one tirade. Courtiers sometimes pretended not to understand, which only enraged him further. Yet he was not entirely without charm. George II loved music. He patronized Handel, whose compositions became staples of royal ceremony. He also enjoyed the outdoors, particularly hunting, which gave him some popularity among the aristocracy, but politics bored him. And like his father, he leaned heavily on ministers. Robert Walpole continued in power under George II, often soothing the king's temper with careful flattery. Walpole understood that ruling the Hanoverians meant not taking their insults personally. Domestic life in George II's household was no less peculiar. His wife, Caroline of Ansbach, was intelligent, witty, and politically savvy. She quietly steered much of the court, smoothing over her husband's rages and guiding policy through subtle influence. George relied on her more than he admitted. When she died in 1737, he was devastated. In an unusually tender remark, he said he would never remarry, declaring that he would only take mistresses, which was both romantic and not romantic at all. George II also had one enduring distinction. He remains the last British monarch to lead troops personally into battle. In 1743, at the Battle of Dettingen, he rode with his soldiers against the French. It was more symbolic than strategic, but it cemented him as a king willing to get his boots muddy. After that, future monarchs were content to watch wars from the safety of maps and reports. Still, his temper, his short stature, and his thick German accent made him a target of ridicule. The satirical prince often depicted him as a little rooster, strutting furiously across the page. Londoners, ever creative, composed ballads, mocking his fits of rage. For all his energy, George II never quite captured public affection. His end was undignified but oddly fitting. In 1760, at age 76, he rose early, as was his habit, and went to his privy closet. There, he suffered a fatal aneurysm while using the chamber pot. He collapsed and died instantly. For a monarch so often the butt of jokes, the circumstances were grimly appropriate. With his death, the throne passed to his grandson, George III. And here the Hanoverian story truly veers into tragedy and myth, because George III, forever remembered as the Mad King, would redefine the dynasty's reputation. Both in Britain and in the rebellious colonies across the sea, George III, the farmer king, and his long unraveling George III, came to the throne in 1760. At just 22 years old, he was fresh-faced, earnest, and determined to be different from his Hanoverian predecessors. Unlike George I and II, he had actually been born in Britain. He spoke English without a German accent. He even declared in his first speech to Parliament that he gloried in the name of Britain. This was a novelty. His grandfather and great-grandfather had always seemed like foreign imports ruling Britain while secretly longing for Hanover. George III, by contrast, presented himself as thoroughly domestic. He was, in effect, marketing himself as the first truly British Hanoverian king. He also came to the throne with lofty ideals. He wanted to be a moral monarch, a family man, a steady hand in turbulent times. And at first he succeeded. George married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, another German princess, but their match was unusually harmonious. Unlike most royal couples, they grew genuinely fond of each other. They had a famously large family, 15 children in total. Charlotte managed the household. George doted on the younger ones, and together they cultivated an image of simple, wholesome domesticity. This earned him the nickname Farmer George. Not because he farmed, though he did take an interest in agriculture, but because he projected a down-to-earth simplicity. He wasn't glamorous like French kings, nor eccentric like some of his ancestors. He was solid, practical, predictable, or so it seemed. George's reign, of course, quickly collided with political storms. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763, leaving Britain triumphant but heavily in debt. To manage those debts, Parliament looked to the colonies, especially the American ones, for revenue. Taxes, duties, stamps. It was all quite logical on paper, but across the Atlantic, colonists were less than thrilled. No taxation without representation became the slogan, and George III, as the visible head of British authority, became the villain. Now, George did not personally draft the Stamp Act or the Townshend duties, but he supported Parliament's right to tax the colonies. And once the crisis spiraled into open rebellion, he backed military suppression. To him, this wasn't about stamps or TIT, was about the authority of the crown. If he gave in on America, where would it stop? The American Revolution unfolded. During his reign, and in colonial propaganda, George III was painted as a tyrant. The Declaration of Independence even includes a laundry list of his supposed crimes. Some were exaggerated, Some were just normal monarchical behavior. But in the new United States, George was immortalized as the bumbling despot they had heroically overthrown. Back in Britain, he was less demonized. Losing the colonies was embarrassing, certainly, but it didn't destroy his reign. Britain still had Canada, the Caribbean, India. Empire endured, and George himself remained popular for his perceived sincerity. What really defined his life was not America, but his health. George began to suffer strange bouts of illness in middle age, periods of intense abdominal pain followed by mental disturbance. He spoke rapidly, incoherently, sometimes for hours. He wrote long, rambling letters, filled with underlined words and disjointed thoughts. At times he seemed convinced he was talking to angels. Courtiers whispered that the king had gone mad. Physicians circled, offering contradictory diagnoses. One treatment involved blistering his skin with hot plasters, as though external pain might draw out the internal derangement. Another was to confine him in straitjackets when he became too agitated. Historians now believe he may have suffered from porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can cause both physical and psychiatric symptoms. Others suggest bipolar disorder. Whatever. The cause, the effect, was devastating. During his lucid periods, George functioned as a capable, even diligent king. He read widely, involved himself in government papers, and supported scientific projects. He corresponded with astronomers, collected art, and took a keen interest in farming innovations. Hence the farmer George's image was not entirely unfounded. He truly did enjoy learning about crop rotation. But when his illness struck, the contrast was shocking. From a sober, earnest monarch, he became a torrent of manic speech, unable to rest. Raving at courtiers who tried to soothe him, his family, bewildered and distressed, tried to hide the truth. But rumors spread quickly. In 1788, a particularly severe episode forced the government into crisis. Parliament debated creating a regency, effectively transferring power to his son, the Prince of Wales. But George eventually recovered enough to resume duties, leading loyalists to celebrate his miraculous restoration. The cycle repeated. Lucid years followed by breakdowns. Ministers and courtiers walked on eggshells. It's never certain which version of the king they would encounter. His family life, once so harmonious, grew strained. Queen Charlotte was exhausted by his illness. The royal children became restless, particularly the eldest son George, Prince of Wales. The younger George, later George IV, was flamboyant, extravagant, and everything his father despised. Where George III valued duty and simplicity, the prince reveled in gambling mistresses and expensive clothes. Father and son clashed constantly. During the king's illnesses, the prince openly maneuvered to seize power. In public, they sniped at each other through speeches and patronage. In private, they loathed one another. For courtiers, navigating between the dutiful father and the dissolute heir was a constant exercise in hypocrisy. Meanwhile, Britain itself was changing. The Industrial Revolution gathered momentum. Cities grew, factories multiplied. A la Napoleonic. Wars erupted, dragging the kingdom into decades of conflict. Through it all, George III remained a symbol of continuity. Even as his personal stability crumbled, by the early 19th century, his condition worsened beyond repair. In 1810, after the death of his beloved daughter Princess Amelia, George sank into a final, permanent breakdown. He was declared unfit to rule, and his son officially became Prince Regent. The king spent his last decade in seclusion at Windsor. Castle, blind, deaf, and mentally lost, he wandered the halls talking to imaginary companions. Servants reported hearing him babble and sing for hours. His once close family avoided him, finding his presence too painful. On January 29, 1820, George III finally died, aged 81. He had reigned for nearly 60 years, the longest reign in British history at that point. But he had spent much of his later decades as a ghost in his own palace. A man trapped between lucidity and madness. Posterity has been kinder to him than his contemporaries. The American Revolution tarnished his image abroad, but in Britain he is remembered less as a tyrant than as a tragic figure. A decent man undone by illness. a king who wanted to be steady and ordinary, yet whose body and mind betrayed him. Farmer. George became not an insult, but a symbol of sincerity. Compared to his extravagant son, George III seemed almost virtuous. His legacy, oddly enough, rests not on conquests or policies, but on his humanity, his attempt to live as a dutiful father and monarch, and the pathos of his decline. From George III's long, unraveling reign, the stage was set for his son, regent later George IV, and if George III embodied duty and decency, George IV would embody the exact opposite: vanity, excess, and self-indulgence on a scale that would make even Louis XIV raise an eyebrow. George IV, the regent of excess, when George III finally slipped into permanent madness. His eldest son, also named George, got exactly what he had been waiting for: power. In 1811, Parliament officially appointed him as Prince Regent. Nearly a decade he ruled in his father's stead, before formally becoming George IV in 1820. And if his father was remembered for frugality, duty, and moral earnestness, George IV was remembered for none of those things. Instead, he became the monarch of indulgence, excess, and spectacle. Where his father wanted to be the simple farmer George, the son wanted to be the glittering centerpiece of every room, the walking embodiment of luxury. George was born in 1762, the eldest of George III's 15 children. From the beginning, he was spoiled. His parents indulged him, and courtiers fawned over him as the heir. But he quickly discovered that he preferred pleasure to discipline. Tutors despaired over his lack of focus. He gambled heavily, drank deeply, and cultivated a taste for extravagant clothing. He grew into a man of contradictions. On the one hand, he was intelligent, witty, and capable of charming conversation. On the other, he was lazy, vain, and perpetually in debt. His appearance changed dramatically over time: in youth slim and fashionable, in middle age swollen from overindulgence, by the end obese and struggling to breathe after walking across a room. Contemporaries joked that he measured his waistline, it's not in inches but in yards. His love life was no less chaotic. In the 1780s, while still a young prince, George secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic. The marriage was legally invalid under British law, but he treated her as his wife for years. It was a scandal kept half secret, half public. Like most of his affairs, when his debts became overwhelming, Parliament forced him into a more official marriage. In 1795, he wed Princess Caroline of Brunswick. The match was disastrous from the first meeting. Carell later said her husband was very fat and nothing like as handsome as his portrait. George, for his part, found her vulgar and unhygienic. He was reportedly drunk at the wedding and passed out on the floor after the ceremony. They produced one daughter, Princess Charlotte, but lived separately almost immediately. Their loathing became a public spectacle, with Caroline accused of scandalous behavior and George publicly trying to divorce her. The entire kingdom took sides, turning their marital feud into a national soap opera. As Prince Regent, George reveled in ceremony. He adored fine art, architecture, and fashion. His taste leaned toward the flamboyant, sometimes the ridiculous. He poured money into building projects: the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, fantasy palace of domes, minarets, and oriental decor. It looked like something from a dream after too much spiced wine. He also commissioned improvements at Windsor and Buckingham Palace, spending lavishly even as the nation grappled with war debt. Parliament grumbled, taxpayers sighed, and George kept decorating. Clothing was another obsession. In youth, he was known as the first gentleman of Europe for his style. He worked closely with his tailor, experimenting with cuts, fabrics, and colors. Later, when his body expanded, his wardrobe became an elaborate attempt at camouflage corsets, padded coats, layers of embroidery. Courtiers pretended not to notice when the seams strained, but beyond fashion and architecture, George loved food. He ate with enthusiasm, if not restraint. Banquets groaned with meats, pastries, and wines. Breakfast alone could involve several courses. By middle age, his health deteriorated from gout, dropsy, and obesity. Walking became difficult, stairs exhausting. He required mechanical aids to move about his palaces. Doctors prescribed moderation. George politely ignored them. He preferred rich sauces to medical advice. Politically, his reign was less flamboyant. Much of the actual governing was handled by ministers like Lord Liverpool and later Canning. George preferred ceremonial roles, opening Parliament, reviewing troops, hosting grand events. He was present, but rarely engaged. One notable moment was his role in the Catholic emancipation crisis. Personally, George opposed granting political rights to Catholics, despite his own youthful marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. But under pressure from his ministers, he reluctantly gave assent in 1829. It was one of the few serious decisions of his reign, and he made it grudgingly. The great tragedy of his personal life was his daughter, Princess Charlotte. She was the only legitimate child of his marriage to Caroline, and thus the future of the dynasty. Bright, spirited, and popular with the public, Charlotte offered hope that the Hanoverian line might shed some of its baggage. But in 1817, Charlotte died, giving birth to a stillborn child. The double loss shattered the nation. George himself was shaken, though he grieved more privately. With Charlotte gone, the succession fell to his brothers, who scrambled to marry and produce heirs. Eventually, one of them succeeded, giving Britain the future Queen Victoria. But in George's lifetime, the loss of Charlotte deepened his unpopularity. Without her, the people had only him and his excess to focus on. Public opinion of George IV was largely negative. Satirists skewered him as gluttonous, vain, and frivolous. Caricatures exaggerated his girth, his powdered wigs, his endless mistresses. He became a figure of ridicule, the butt of jokes in pamphlets and prints. Even his coronation in 1821 was overshadowed by scandal. Caroline, his estranged queen, attempted to attend only to be barred at the door. The spectacle turned into a national embarrassment. His own ministers often despised him.
Duke of Wellington
once remarked that George IV told lies whenever he thought it suited his purpose. Lord Grey described him as the worst man I have ever known. Even those obliged to flatter him privately admitted their relief when audiences ended. Yet, despite all this, George left a lasting cultural mark. His patronage of the arts enriched Britain's collections. His taste for architecture reshaped royal residences. He encouraged the Regency style, an aesthetic of elegance and refinement that outlived him. He may not have been a great king, but he was an influential consumer. His excess funded artists, builders, and designers who defined the look of an era. By the late 1820s, George's health had collapsed. He lived in near seclusion, swollen with dropsy, barely able to breathe. His eyesight dimmed, his hands shook. He relied on laudanum and alcohol to dull the pain. Courtiers described him as a shadow of his former flamboyant self. On June 26, 1830, George IV died at Windsor Castle, aged 67. Few mourned him. Even his brother, who succeeded as William IV, described George as selfish, ill-tempered, and not very clever, a harsh epitaph, but one that reflected the general mood. George IV's reign is remembered less for politics than for personality. He was extravagant, vain, and often ridiculous. But he also shaped the cultural identity of Britain's Regency period. He left behind palaces, paintings, and style if not respect. Where his father symbolized duty, George IV symbolized indulgence. Together, they embodied the extremes of monarchy: the earnest king undone by illness, and the frivolous king undone by himself. With his death, the throne passed to William IV, his younger brother. And if George IV was all lace and luxury, William was something else entirely: blunt, eccentric, and unexpectedly practical. William IV, the accidental sailor, King Win, George IV finally ate and drank himself into the grave in 1830. The throne did not pass to a glamorous young heir. Instead, it landed on the shoulders of his younger brother William, already in his mid-60s, gray-haired, and rather astonished to be king at all. William had spent most of his life assuming he would never wear the crown. He was the third son of George III, born in 1765. For decades had been comfortably overshadowed by elder brothers. This gave him an unusual degree of freedom. While George IV wallowed in lace and mistresses, William pursued a naval career, earning himself the nickname the Sailor King. He joined the Navy at 13, serving in the Caribbean and North America. By most accounts, he was competent enough, though not brilliant. He fought in the American Revolutionary War, but his most notable contribution was simply surviving. His royal status sometimes spared him from the worst assignments, but he also saw enough action to feel he had truly earned the uniform. His naval years gave him a lifelong fondness for ships, sailors, and salty language. Courtiers later found him refreshingly blunt compared to his over-polished brothers. He swore like a midshipman, told rambling sea stories at dinner, and treated servants with an unusual informality when asked for his opinion on court etiquette. William often shrugged and muttered that he preferred the Navy's straightforward ways. It wasn't regal, but it was honest. William's personal life was unconventional. For 2 decades, he lived with the actress Dorothea Jordan. They never married, but together they had 10 children, known collectively as the Fitzclarences. William adored them. For years, the couple lived as a kind of unofficial family at Bushy House. In a different century, this arrangement might have caused scandal. But compared to his brother George IV's chaos, William's domesticity with Dorothea seemed almost wholesome. They raised their children with affection, if not legitimacy. William sometimes joked that he had more heirs than he knew what to do with, just none that Parliament would accept. When financial pressures mounted, however, William abandoned Dorothea in 1811, leaving her with a modest allowance. She died a few years later in poverty, a rather sad end for the mother of his many children. William, meanwhile, eventually agreed to marry a proper princess when it became clear the throne might one day be his. In 1818, he wed Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, a much younger German duchess. The marriage surprised many by being genuinely affectionate. William gave up most of his old habits, settled into quieter domestic life, and treated Adelaide with respect. They never had surviving children. But their partnership was stable, something rare in the Hanoverian dynasty. When George IV died without legitimate heirs, William suddenly became king at 64. The public, weary of George IV's extravagance, greeted William's plainness with relief. He wasn't stylish, he wasn't glamorous, but he was approachable. He walked the streets of London with minimal guard, chatting with shopkeepers, shaking hands. Ordinary people called him the Citizen King. His informality shocked courtiers but delighted the crowd. At his coronation, he refused the lavish spectacle his brother had insisted on. Instead, he ordered a stripped-down ceremony, saving a fortune and earning public approval. It was almost suspicious. A Hanoverian king people actually liked, politically. William's reign coincided with major upheaval. The 1830s were years of reform, agitation, and growing demands for change. The most significant was the Reform Act of 1832, which restructured parliamentary representation and expanded the electorate. The measure was controversial. Tories resisted it, fearing it would destabilize society. Whigs pushed for it, arguing it would ease discontent. William himself was hesitant, but eventually gave royal assent after political crises made it unavoidable. By doing so, he helped steer Britain toward gradual reform rather than revolution. It was perhaps the most consequential act of his reign, the one achieved less through personal conviction than through political necessity. Despite his plain manners, William was not without quirks. He had a tendency to ramble in public speeches, sometimes wandering off topic entirely. Once addressing Parliament, he veered into a long anecdote about naval supplies before anyone could redirect him. Ministers winced, but audiences found it endearing. He also had a sharp temper. He could be blunt to the point of rudeness, shouting at courtiers when irritated. Once, during a dispute over palace expenses, he allegedly threw papers across the room and stormed out muttering sailors' curses. His servants, far from offended, found it refreshing after decades of George IV's pompous self-importance. And unlike his predecessors, William disliked living in London's palaces. He preferred Windsor or smaller residences, where he could live more casually. The gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, heavily redecorated by George IV, left him unimpressed. Family dynamics remained complicated. William's many illegitimate Fitzclarence children were affectionate but politically sidelined. His marriage to Adelaide, though warm, produced only short-lived infants. With no heirs of his own, succession loomed over his reign. The next in line was his niece, Princess Victoria, daughter of his late brother Edward. William openly supported her, despite tension with her mother, the Duchess of Kent. He despised the Duchess's controlling influence and once declared, at Victoria's birthday dinner, that he hoped to live long enough to prevent her mother from becoming regent. It was a spectacularly awkward toast, delivered in front of guests and the mortified Victoria herself. But it reflected his blunt honesty. William disliked intrigue and made little effort to disguise his feelings. As King, William also took a keen interest in the Navy, naturally. He meddled in naval appointments, offered advice on shipbuilding, and reminisced endlessly about his days at sea. Admirals humored him, though some rolled their eyes at his outdated opinions. Still, his genuine affection for sailors earned him loyalty among the fleet. His reign was short, only 7 years, but it marked a transition. Britain, under William, moved from the flamboyant Regency era toward the more restrained Victorian age. He was a bridge figure, less theatrical than George IV, less iconic than Victoria, but necessary to carry the monarchy across a turbulent decade. By the late 1830s, he grew frail, often bedridden, though he clung stubbornly to life. His one wish was to survive until Victoria turned 18 so that she could succeed him without a regency. Against the odds, he managed it. On June 20th, 1837, William IV died at Windsor, aged 71. Victoria, just past her 18th birthday, became queen. The people remembered William fondly, not as a great king, but as a decent one, plain, practical, and mercifully free of George IV's nonsense. He had been the accidental monarch, the sailor who never expected to reign. And in his own rough-edged way, he had done the job. His reign closed the Hanoverian chapter with an odd kind of dignity. No grandeur, no melodrama. Just a blunt sailor king who kept the monarchy afloat until the Victorian age could begin. And of course, once Victoria took the throne, the royal household would shift again into an era of moral performance, mourning, rituals, and an empire stretching further than ever before. Victoria, the girl who became an institution when William IV finally gave up the ghost in 1837, the throne passed to his teenage niece. She was just 18, barely out of the schoolroom, small in stature, and so inexperienced that some courtiers doubted she would survive her first audience without fainting. Her name was Alexandrina Victoria, though she dropped the Alexandrina part immediately. It sounded too fussy, too Russian. Just Victoria was enough. So the Victorian age began. The teenager who could barely reach the ground from her throne chair. Victoria's childhood had been stifling. Her father, the Duke of Kent, died when she was an infant, leaving her in the care of her mother, the Duchess of Kent. The Duchess, guided by her advisor, Sir John Conroy, kept Victoria on what was called the Kensington system. It was less a system and more a gilded cage. Victoria was never allowed to walk down the stairs alone, never permitted private company, and rarely left unaccompanied, even in gardens. She shared a bedroom with her mother until she was queen. Conroy hoped to control her, to make himself indispensable. The effect was exactly the opposite. By the time she turned 18, Victoria loathed both her mother and Conroy. One of her first acts as queen was to banish Conroy from her household. She also insisted on her own apartment separate from her mother for the first time in her life. It was a small rebellion, but symbolically enormous. At first, the public adored her. Here was a fresh, innocent young queen after decades of corpulent Hanoverian kings. She was seen as pure, unspoiled, even angelic. Her small size and youthful looks added to the aura. London erupted in celebrations at her accession, delighted that the monarchy had a new face. But the glow faded quickly. Inexperience led to mistakes. In 1839, Victoria was embroiled in the bedchamber crisis. Her prime minister, Lord Melbourne, resigned, and the incoming Tory leader Robert Peel requested that she replace some of her Whig ladies-in-waiting with Tory ones. Victoria refused, insisting on keeping her friends. Pell declined to form a government under those conditions. Melbourne returned. It was technically constitutional, but politically clumsy. Victoria looked like a petulant girl refusing to share her toys. The press criticized her. The public muttered. Already her popularity wobbled, and then there was her marriage. In 1840, Victoria wed her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. She was smitten. Albert was serious, principled, and at least by 19th century standards handsome. She pursued him more than he pursued her, writing in her diary after their engagement that she'd never spent such an evening in her life. Their partnership defined the rest of her reign. Victoria adored Albert to the point of obsession. She leaned on him for guidance, deferred to his judgment, and eventually let him manage much of the machinery of monarchy. He became her moral compass, her chief advisor, and, increasingly, her controlling influence. Albert, for his part, was earnest but somewhat humorless. He believed in duty, improvement, and moral order. He frowned on frivolity. He designed model farms, promoted education, and organized the Great Exhibition of 1851, showcasing British industry under a giant glass palace in Hyde Park. It was impressive, but hardly thrilling. Where Victoria could be emotional, Albert was steady, sometimes stiflingly so. Their dynamic became a textbook case of Victorian domestic ideals: the devoted wife, the serious husband, the household as a moral beacon. Together, they produced 9 children. Victoria viewed pregnancy with disdain, once describing it as the shadow side of marriage. She also disliked babies, calling them frog-like. But she kept having them nonetheless, and their descendants eventually married into nearly every European royal house, giving Victoria the later nickname Grandmother of Europe. Family life was both idyllic and tense. Albert enforced routines and high standards, while Victoria's moods fluctuated wildly. She adored her husband, but sometimes resented his authority. Their children bore the brunt of this dynamic raised. In a household of strict morality, yet with flashes of maternal coldness, Victoria herself had a mercurial temperament. She was capable of great affection, but also sudden rages. Her letters could be scathing, her judgments sharp. She wept easily, sulked openly, and sometimes clashed with ministers in ways that alarmed Parliament. She was not a neutral figurehead. She was emotional, reactive, and deeply personal in her politics. Her devotion to Albert softened her public image somewhat. But when he died suddenly in 1861, everything changed. Albert's death at just 42 shattered Victoria. She plunged into grief so profound that it became her defining trait. She wore black mourning clothes for the rest of her life, 40 years of widowhood in eternal shadow. She withdrew from public appearances, spending months sequestered in Balmoral or Osborne House. The public grew restless. The queen who vanished from sight seemed dangerously close to irrelevance. Republican murmurs surfaced. But Victoria clung to mourning as both a personal ritual and a political statement. She recast herself as the grieving widow of the nation, a living symbol of loyalty and loss. This image, combined with Britain's growing empire, gradually reshaped her reputation. She became less the girl queen of 1837 and more the motherly, eternal figurehead of later decades. In her private life, though, things remained more complicated. She relied heavily on her Scottish servant John Brown, whose bluntness and loyalty endeared him to her. Their closeness sparked gossip of a romantic relationship, whispers she neither confirmed nor denied. After Brown's death, she commissioned statues and memorials for him, further fueling speculation. Later, she grew similarly attached to Abdul Karim, an Indian attendant who became her munshi or teacher. He instructed her in Hindustani An Urdu and their relationship caused alarm among courtiers, who disliked the influence of a young foreign servant over the aging queen. Victoria ignored their protests. She enjoyed who she enjoyed. Her reign stretched on, decade after decade, outlasting ministers, wars, and revolutions. By the time she celebrated her Golden Jubilee in 1887, she had transformed from a fragile teenager into an institution. The empire spanned continents. Railways crisscrossed the land, and industrial power had remade society. Through it all, Victoria remained constant, if not always visible. She became less a person and more a symbol. Her face appeared on coins, stamps, and statues. Colonies named cities, lakes, and mountains after her. Victorian ceased to mean simply pertaining to Victoria and came to define an entire era of moral codes, architecture, fashion, and empire. Yet the private woman behind the public symbol was always more volatile. She remained emotional, stubborn, and passionately attached to those she loved. Her grief never softened, her temper never disappeared, and her contradictions never truly resolved. Victoria reigned until 1901, the longest-serving monarch in British history up to that point. By the end, she was nearly unrecognizable from the girl of 1837, a stout, black-clad matriarch confined to a wheelchair. Presiding over an empire both vast and brittle, her legacy was complicated. She embodied stability, yet she was often unstable. She symbolized moral virtue, yet her private letters were full of biting remarks. She was both a domestic ideal and a domineering personality, but perhaps that very contradiction was why she endured. People could project whatever they wanted onto Victoria: innocence, motherhood, empire, mourning. She was all of those things and none of them fully. And with her death in 1901, the long Hanoverian chapter closed, replaced by the Saxe-Coburg and Gotha dynasty, soon renamed Windsor. When German surnames became less fashionable, from a tiny teenager escaping the Kensington system to an elderly widow ruling the world's largest empire, Victoria's life spanned more than 60 years of change, contradiction, and quiet eccentricity. Victoria's brood, the grandmother of Europe, Victoria and Albert, produced 9 children. In theory, this was excellent for dynastic stability. More heirs, more alliances, more options. In practice, it meant the royal nursery became the launchpad for half of Europe's monarchies, all linked by blood and occasionally by unfortunate hereditary diseases. The children were raised in what Albert believed was an ideal domestic environment: discipline, study, moral rigor. Victoria went along with it, though. She sometimes resented being endlessly pregnant. She often described her own babies in less than flattering terms. A frightful object was her assessment of one newborn. Maternal warmth was not her strong suit. Still, the children grew up to play major roles in European dynastic politics. Born in 1840, she was bright, ambitious, and eager to please her father. Albert adored her, grooming her to embody his ideals of intelligence and morality. At 17, she married Prince Frederick of Prussia, later German Emperor Frederick III. As Crown Princess of Prussia, Vicky tried to import her father's liberal, constitutional values. Unfortunately, Prussia was not particularly receptive. Her husband was mild and sympathetic, but his reign was short, just 99 days in 1888 before he died of throat cancer. Their son Wilhelm took the throne instead. This was awkward, because Wilhelm and his mother despised each other. Vicky thought him arrogant and reactionary. Wilhelm thought her meddling and condescending. The result was a toxic family feud that spilled into politics. Wilhelm grew up to be Kaiser Wilhelm II. His blunders helped set the stage for the First World War, which meant that Victoria's firstborn, through no particular fault of her own, gave Europe one of its greatest catastrophes. The second child was Albert Edward, nicknamed Bertie. He was destined to be king, though no one expected it to take quite so long. Born in 1841, he spent his entire youth in the shadow of his mother and father, who considered him lazy and frivolous. Bertie was not academic. He preferred parties, races, and women. Albert tried to discipline him into seriousness, but it backfired. At 19, Bertie had a brief affair with an actress, which horrified his parents. Albert traveled in the cold November weather to lecture him about morality, and promptly contracted the illness that killed him. Victoria, inconsolable, blamed Bertie for Albert's death. A guilt trip that lingered for decades. Bertie's punishment was to spend nearly 60 years waiting. He finally became Edward VII in 1901, already old, round, and well-practiced in leisure. By then, he had refined idleness into an art form. The third child was Alice, born in 1843. She was thoughtful, serious, and deeply influenced by her father's ideals of service. She married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and settled in Darmstadt. Alice's life was marked by both devotion and tragedy. She nursed the wounded during the Austro-Prussian War, established hospitals, and promoted nursing as a profession. Daughter Alex would later marry Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, becoming the ill-fated Empress Alexandra. Alice herself died young. At 35, after contracting diphtheria from her children, her death was another blow to Victoria, who had already lost Albert and clung fiercely to her surviving children. Alfred came next. Born in 1844, he was practical, less flashy than Bertie, and pursued a naval career like his uncle William IV had. Once done, he rose through the ranks, though not without royal assistance. Eventually, he became Duke of Edinburgh and married Grand Duchess Maria Alexandrovna of Russia. This match pleased some and alarmed others. Britain and Russia were hardly natural friends. The marriage itself was not particularly happy.
Alfred
Drank heavily, and Maria found British court life provincial compared to St. Petersburg still. They produced children, adding yet another line to Victoria's sprawling family web. Helena, born in 1846, was perhaps the least dramatic. She married Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, a minor German royal, and lived a relatively quiet life. Helena focused on nursing, charity work, and writing. She was practical, dependable, and notably less scandal-prone than her siblings. In family gatherings, she was the steady presence while others quarreled. Every dynasty needs at least one person willing to sit politely through the shouting. Next came Louise. Louise scandalized some by marrying not a foreign prince, but a British aristocrat, John Campbell, Duke of Argyll. It was one of the rare royal marriages that felt like a personal choice rather than a dynastic arrangement. Louise pursued art seriously, sculpting and painting, and was known for her wit. She brought a touch of individuality into a family otherwise consumed with duty and appearances. Arthur. He entered the army, rose through the ranks, and served in various colonies. Military life suited him. He was disciplined, loyal, and capably imaginative. He lived to 91, one of the longest-lived of Victoria's children, carrying the family name well into the 20th century. Leopold, born in 1853, was the most fragile. He inherited hemophilia, a blood disorder that plagued several of Victoria's descendants. The disease caused frequent bleeding episodes and made even minor injuries life-threatening. Despite this, Leopold was intelligent and cultivated. He became Duke of Albany, married and fathered children. But in 1884, at just 30, he died after a fall triggered fatal bleeding. His death highlighted the darker side of Victoria's genetic legacy. Through her, hemophilia spread into the royal houses of Spain, Germany, and Russia, with disastrous consequences. The youngest was Beatrice, born in 1857. She became Victoria's closest companion in widowhood, effectively her live-in secretary. Victoria relied on her so much that she initially forbade Beatrice from marrying, insisting she remain by her side. Eventually, Victoria relented, and Beatrice married Prince Henry of Battenberg. But the condition was that they live with Victoria. Beatrice spent much of her life balancing her role as daughter, wife, and caretaker to the Queen. After Victoria's death, Beatrice also edited her mother's journals, though edited might be generous, since she cut and censored heavily, sanitizing the record for posterity. Taken together, Victoria's 9 children spread across Europe, like a dynasty-building machine. They married into the royal houses of Germany, Russia, Denmark, and beyond. By 1900, nearly every throne in Europe had a direct connection to her, but the genetic side effects were less welcome. Hemophilia haunted her descendants, most famously in the Russian royal family, where Tsarevich Alexei's illness destabilized the Romanovs and opened the door to Rasputin's influence. Marital tensions also multiplied. Cousins married cousins. Alliances soured and personal feuds spilled into politics. By 1914, and Nicholas II of Russia were all Victoria's grandchildren. Instead of fostering harmony, their family ties did little to prevent war. If anything, the sense of rivalry was intensified by their closeness. The grandmother of Europe had inadvertently created a continental family quarrel that erupted into the First World War. Victoria herself had once been delighted by her children's dynastic spread, seeing it as proof of her family's central role in Europe. She could hardly have predicted that her bloodline would both unite and divide the continent. Her brood left a legacy both vast and fragile, thrones filled, empires connected, and diseases carried quietly in their veins. Royal family tree that looked impressive on paper but carried cracks beneath the surface. Cousins at war, George, Wilhelm, and Nicholas by the dawn of the 20th century. Queen Victoria's descendants were everywhere. Her children had dutifully married across Europe, and her grandchildren now sat on thrones from London to St. Petersburg. On paper, this should have been a recipe for stability. After all, who would risk war when the enemy was also a cousin? As it turned out, cousins can be surprisingly poor at conflict resolution. Let's start with George V of Britain. Born in 1865, he wasn't actually meant to be king at all. His elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, nicknamed Eddie, was the heir. But Eddie died suddenly of pneumonia in 1892, leaving the crown to George. George was not a flamboyant man. He was reserved, stiff, and rather dour. He loved stamp collecting. In fact, he built one of the world's most valuable stamp collections, which says a great deal about his temperament. He married his dead brother's fiancée, Princess Mary, of Teck, which was practical if slightly macabre. Their marriage was steady, if not wildly passionate. George preferred routine, early dinners, long walks, naval discipline. He was not a man of soaring charisma, but he was reliable, which given what came next was just as well. Across the North Sea, his cousin Wilhelm II was quite the opposite. Born in 1859, Wilhelm was the son of Victoria's eldest daughter, Vicky, and the German Emperor, Frederick III. His birth was complicated, leaving him with a withered left arm from a damaged nerve. This disability haunted him all his life. Wilhelm overcompensated with bluster, craved military displays, grand uniforms, and constant attention. Where George enjoyed stamps, Wilhelm enjoyed strutting about in spiked helmets. He was intelligent but erratic, often bombastic in public and insecure. In private, his relationship with his mother was bitter, his politics reactionary, and his speeches frequently alarmed Europe. He adored the Navy, building warships as though they were toys. This inevitably antagonized Britain, an island nation quite attached to its own naval superiority. For George, it was a threat. For Wilhelm, it was a matter of pride. For Europe, it was one more step toward disaster. And then there was Nicholas II of Russia, born in 1868, another grandson of Victoria, though more distantly connected through marriage lines. Nicholas ascended the throne in 1894, painfully unprepared. Nicholas was gentle and affectionate in private life, but weak and indecisive as a ruler. He loved his wife, Alexandra Victoria's granddaughter, and their children. He preferred family life to politics, which would have been admirable if he hadn't also been the autocrat of a vast, unstable empire. His reign was marked by poor judgment, disastrous wars, repression of reform, and an inability to manage Russia's deepening crises. Nicholas believed in divine right, but his actual abilities fell short. The gap between his authority and his competence widened steadily until it collapsed altogether. The three cousins George, Wilhelm, and Nicholas occasionally met at family gatherings. Photographs survive of them together, bearded men in nearly identical uniforms, smiling stiffly at one another. They looked like brothers at a costume party, only the costumes were actual military attire. Beneath the smiles, tensions brewed. Wilhelm resented Britain's global influence. George distrusted Wilhelm's erratic style. Nicholas clung to his crown as unrest spread at home. They were related by blood but divided by politics, personality, and pride. When the First World War loomed in 1914, these family ties did little to prevent catastrophe. Wilhelm's Germany backed Austria-Hungary after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Russia mobilized in support of Serbia. Britain, tied to France and Belgium, moved against Germany. Letters between the cousins in July 1914 reveal a last attempt at familial diplomacy. Wilhelm and Nicholas wrote to each other as Willie and Nicky, pleading for restraint. The tone was almost domestic-like, cousins trying to smooth over a squabble at Christmas dinner. But the machinery of alliances, armies, and mobilizations moved faster than cousinly affection. By August, Europe was at war. The war was unkind to monarchs. Nicholas's Russia descended into chaos. The war effort strained the empire to breaking point. Food shortages, military defeats, and political unrest exploded into revolution in 1917. Nicholas abdicated, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. He and his family were placed under arrest, moved from palace to palace, finally executed by Bolsheviks in 1918. The man who loved his wife and children, but could not steer an empire, ended his days in a cellar in Ekaterinburg. George, meanwhile, held on. Britain endured for years of war, immense sacrifice, and social upheaval, but George himself adapted, if grudgingly. He even changed the family name. Up until 1917, the British royal family had been known as the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Inconveniently German name during a war against Germany, so George rebranded. Out went the Germanic syllables, in came something more solid, more English. Windsor. Inspired, supposedly, by Windsor Castle, though critics joked he could just as easily have chosen Balmoral or Sandringham. It was a cosmetic change, but an effective one. From then on, Britain's royals were Windsor's German roots airbrushed away. George survived the war, emerging as a more cautious, respected monarch. His love of stamps remained. His reign was not dazzling, but it was steady and in the rubble. Of empires, steady counted for a lot. Wilhelm fared far worse. Germany's war effort collapsed in 1918, revolution broke out, and Wilhelm abdicated. The man who had spent decades dressing as a warrior emperor fled to the Netherlands, where he lived in exile. He never returned to Germany. Instead, he spent his final years in a Dutch manor house, chopping wood obsessively and railing against modernity. He hated democracy, distrusted the Weimar Republic, and was horrified by jazz. When the Nazis rose, he hoped they might restore. Him they did not. Wilhelm died in 1941, still dreaming of an imperial restoration, still cutting logs, still living in the shadow of what might have been. So by the end of the Great War, the scoreboard looked like this. Nicholas was dead. Along with his dynasty, Wilhelm was in exile, nursing grievances. George remained on his throne, now as the symbolic anchor of a battered empire. The three cousins, once gathered in matching uniforms at family weddings, ended up scattered by war, one deposed, one exiled, one diminished but surviving. It is tempting to imagine that, had they been closer, Europe might have avoided disaster. But history is rarely so tidy. Their family connections were outweighed by national interests, by militarism, and by the sheer momentum of political crises. Still, the irony lingers. The First World War was, in many ways, a family quarrel. Victoria's grandchildren, raised under the same matriarchal shadow, found themselves commanding armies against one another. They were cousins, but also emperors, and kings in those roles proved stronger than blood. The legacy of these cousins remains etched in the 20th century. Nicholas left behind the tragic image of the Romanovs, a royal family destroyed. Wilhelm left the specter of German militarism and bitterness that helped feed later conflicts. George left the Windsor dynasty, slimmed down, more symbolic. and still carrying the monarchy into the present. 3 men, 3 paths, bound by ancestry but divided by circumstance. They were the grandchildren of Queen Victoria, but their family ties could not withstand the storm they unleashed. Edward VIII, the king who wouldn't sit still when George V died in 1936, his second son became king. The first son, Albert Victor, had long since died, and the next in line was Edward, known to friends and family as David. Edward VIII was unlike his father in almost every possible. George V had been stiff, serious, and rooted in routine. Edward was restless, charming, and allergic to responsibility. He hated protocol, despised paperwork, and preferred gallivanting abroad to sitting through briefings. He was stylish, tan, and photogenic, adored by newspapers and women alike. He looked like a modern monarch's slim suits, swept-back hair, a smile that suggested he had just remembered a private joke. But beneath the polish there wasn't much substance, even before he became king. Edward's private life was a source of gossip. He had a string of affairs with married women, which his father disapproved of strongly. George V once remarked that after his death, Edward would ruin himself within 12 months. It turned out to be a very accurate prediction because, by the time he became king, Edward had already fallen deeply for Wallis Simpson. Wallis was an American divorcee, twice divorced. In fact, once she was through with her second husband, she was witty, fashionable, and knew how to hold Edward's attention, which was no small feat. Edward became besotted. He introduced her to friends, took her on holidays, and eventually made it clear that he intended to marry her. This was a problem. The British establishment, government, church, even much of the public was horrified at the idea of a divorced woman becoming queen consort. The Church of England, of which Edward was the supreme governor, still viewed remarriage, after divorce, as unacceptable. Politicians feared scandal, instability, and loss of moral authority. Edward, meanwhile, was not about to give up the only thing that seemed to truly interest him. The crisis built quickly. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin told the king that marriage to Wallis was impossible. Edward countered with the idea of a morganatic marriage, Wallis as his wife, but not as queen. The government refused. The dominions, from Canada to Australia, weighed in against it. The entire imperial structure creaked under the strain of a lovesick monarch. For Edward, it boiled down to a choice: the throne or Wallis. For once, he made a decisive decision. He chose Wallis. On December 11, 1936, Edward addressed the nation by radio. His voice was calm, steady, but unrepentant. He declared he could not carry out the duties of king without the help and support of the woman I love. And with that, he abdicated. It was unprecedented. Kings were supposed to die in office, not resign for romance. The monarchy had survived wars, scandals, and rebellions, but never before had it been voluntarily abandoned for personal desire. Edward left the throne. After just 326 days, the shortest reign of any British monarch in centuries, he was created Duke of Windsor and sent off effectively into elegant exile. The crown passed to his younger brother, shy and stammering Albert, who reluctantly became George VI. His unexpected reign would eventually lead into the Second World War, giving Britain one of its most unexpectedly beloved kings. Edward, meanwhile, married Wallis in 1937 in France. No member of the royal family attended. The wedding was small, chic, and faintly melancholy. Wallis became the Duchess of Windsor, but never Her Royal Highness, a point of lifelong irritation for her. Life after abdication was a long anticlimax. Edward and Wallis drifted between residences in France and the United States, living in stylish comfort, but never quite finding purpose. They socialized with high society, collected trinkets, and gave the impression of being glamorous, but slightly bored. They also developed a reputation for being politically naive or worse. In the late 1930s, Edward expressed admiration for Germany's efficiency. He and Wallis even visited Hitler in 1937, smiling for cameras at Berghof. The photographs have aged poorly. During the Second World War, suspicions lingered that the Duke of Windsor was at best careless, at worst sympathetic to Nazi Germany. Churchill posted him as governor of the Bahamas, a colonial sinecure, far from European politics. Edward hated it. Wallace hated it even more. But it kept them occupied and out of trouble until the war ended. After the war, the couple settled in France, living in a Parisian villa. They filled their days with parties, travel, and shopping. They cultivated an image of sophistication. But to many, they seemed increasingly irrelevant royal curiosities, rather than figures of real influence. Edward wrote memoirs, gave occasional interviews, and nursed a sense of grievance about how he and Wallace had been treated. Wallace surrounded herself with fashion and jewelry, but also carried the weight of being the woman blamed for toppling a king. When Edward died in 1972, his body was returned to Britain for burial near Windsor Castle. Wallace followed in 1986, frail and nearly forgotten. Their story remained both romantic and pathetic, the great love affair that dismantled a crown. Leaving its participants with little more than exile and expensive wardrobes, the abdication crisis had lasting effects. It reshaped the monarchy into something more restrained, more cautious, more careful about image. It thrust George VI into the role that defined him, and by extension prepared the path for his daughter Elizabeth II. Edward, meanwhile, became a symbol of squandered opportunity, charming but shallow, a man who gave up the throne for love, only to discover that love does not always provide enough to fill a lifetime. It was in many ways the most modern of royal scandals. Not war, not treason, but personal choice against public duty. Edward VIII embodied the tension between the monarchy as a human family and the monarchy as an institution. The institution went on without him. George VI, the reluctant king, when Edward VIII abdicated in 1936. The crown fell onto the head of his younger brother, Albert. To most of the public, he was quiet, unassuming, and practically unknown. He preferred the name Bertie. To his family, he was a dutiful son and a nervous man. Now, overnight, he was George V. This was not a role he wanted. Bertie stammered heavily, dreaded public speaking, and loathed attention. He had expected to live his life in relative obscurity, supporting his brother. Now, thanks to Edward's romantic crisis, he had inherited both the throne and an empire, sliding toward another world war. It was the sort of gift no younger sibling ever wants. George had married Elizabeth Bosline in 1923. She was cheerful, pragmatic, and remarkably steady. She became known simply as the Queen, and later, the Queen Mother. Her calm presence balanced her husband's nerves. Where he hesitated, she steadied. Where he doubted, she encouraged. Together they had 2 daughters, Elizabeth born in 1926, and Margaret, born in 1930. At the time of Bertie's coronation, Elizabeth was just 10. No one expected her to become queen quite so soon. But history rarely respects the family calendar. The early years of George V's reign were dominated by the looming specter of war. Hitler's rise in Germany, Mussolini's posturing in Italy, and the general unraveling of European diplomacy cast a long shadow. The king had little direct political power, but he symbolized stability. Britain badly needed stability. George himself was not glamorous, not dazzling, but he was solid. He forced himself through his stammer with the help of speech therapy, most famously with Lionel Logue, the Australian therapist immortalized decades later in film. It was slow progress, but it mattered. In moments of national crisis, a monarch had to be able to speak. When war broke out in 1939, George and Elizabeth made the choice to remain in London. They refused to send the princesses abroad despite suggestions that Canada might be safer. "The children will not go without me," Elizabeth said. "I will not go without the king, and the king will never go." This stubbornness mattered. London was bombed repeatedly during the Blitz. Buckingham Palace itself was struck 9 times. When it happened, Elizabeth remarked dryly that now she could look the East End in the face. The royal family endured the same dangers as their subjects, albeit in far better housing. and it built a bond of loyalty that Edward had squandered. George's reign was not without tension. He distrusted politicians at times, and the stress of the war weighed on him. His health began to falter under the strain. He was also aware that the empire around him was changing. India pushed for independence. Colonies questioned their future. Britain's position as global hegemon grew shakier with each passing year. But George himself represented a simpler image: duty, quiet persistence, and reluctant courage. He did not inspire wild devotion, but he reassured. Sometimes reassurance is enough. After the war, Britain emerged victorious but exhausted. Food rationing continued, debts mounted, and the empire's fabric frayed. Yet the monarchy remained one of the few constants. The king was ailing, but he was still there, still appearing on balconies, still waving dutifully. By the early 1950s, however, his health collapsed. Years of smoking and strain caught up with him. In 1952, George VI died at just 56, the crown passed to his daughter Elizabeth, then 25. Who was abroad in Kenya when she received the news. Elizabeth II inherited a monarchy in transition. The empire was dissolving, television was arriving, and Britain itself was shrinking from world superpower to middling power. Elizabeth, small in stature but composed in manner, became the face of continuity. Her reign began with the optimism of the early 1950s, complete with coronation, pomp, and post-war rebuilding. But it stretched so far and so long that she became less a person than a backdrop. Her silhouette, her voice, her Christmas broadcasts all became part of Britain's furniture. Privately, Elizabeth was cautious, dutiful, and deeply conservative in her habits. She adored horses, corgis, and the countryside. She was less enamored with modern trends. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, she struggled to make the monarchy appear relevant. Her family did not always help. Charles grew into a sensitive, somewhat awkward heir. Anne was forthright. Andrew courted scandal. Edward floated somewhere in between. The Queen herself, however, endured. She rarely gave interviews, rarely showed strong emotion in public, and cultivated an aura of mystery that doubled as insulation. In 1992, famously described her year as an annus horribilis. 3 of her children's marriages collapsed. Windsor Castle caught fire. Public sentiment toward the monarchy sagged. For a woman who preferred stability, it was deeply unpleasant. Then came 1997 and the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. The public response was overwhelming. The Queen's initial reserve staying in Scotland, avoiding immediate comment made. Her seem out of touch. Crowds outside Buckingham Palace demanded visible grief. Elizabeth adjusted, appearing on television and bowing as Diana's coffin passed. But the episode revealed the tightrope the monarchy now walked. Tradition on one side, public opinion on the other. Still, Elizabeth adapted. Slowly, carefully, but enough. She presided over jubilees, adapted to television and the internet, and remained a figure of calm through crises. Her reign stretched longer than any monarch in British history, outlasting prime ministers, wars, and cultural revolutions. She did not dazzle. She did not thrill, but like her father, she reassured. In an era of constant upheaval, reassurance has a curious power. By the time of her Platinum Jubilee in 2022, Elizabeth was less a ruler than a symbol, the grandmother of a nation, watching from her balcony, frail but enduring. She had reigned so long that most of her subjects had never known another monarch. Her death later that year closed a chapter that began with her reluctant father stepping into the breach in 1936. From Edward VIII's abdication to Elizabeth II's 70-year reign, the House of Windsor had redefined itself again and again, sometimes stumbling, sometimes adapting, but always surviving. The story of George VI and Elizabeth II is less dramatic than Edward VIII's scandal, perhaps more telling. Abdications make headlines. Quiet endurance makes history. George never wanted the throne, but he carried it. Elizabeth was born into it, and she made it last. Between them, they turned a monarchy once endangered by scandal into a steady, if imperfect, institution. And like so many of Victoria's descendants before them, they proved that royalty is less about grandeur than about surviving the family drama long enough to wave from the balcony.